Welcome to the third part of our discussion of the brain. We will discuss the midbrain and forebrain in this section. The midbrain is the part that connects the hindbrain to the forebrain. It's kind of in the middle, and it's a group of structures that are less discernible than the structures we've previously discussed in the hindbrain, the cerebellum, medulla, and the pons. The midbrain includes the cerebral aqueduct that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So that aqueduct is a space and contains cerebrospinal fluid. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 both exit from the midbrain. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. They both deal with eye movement. And this relates to the function of another structure we're going to look at in a second that moves the eyes in relation to an object that's being tracked. So as you're following an object with your eyes, that tracking function is integrated in the midbrain. We also have cerebral peduncles. A peduncle is a stem, and this stem connects the hindbrain to the forebrain. The peduncles hold the corticospinal tract, a group of nerves that go from the cortex of the brain down to the spine and out to the effectors or muscles. The tegmentum connects the midbrain to the cerebellum and helps with control of fine movements. The tegmentum is going to be the more inferior portion of the midbrain. We also have a group of cells called the substantia nigra that sends inhibitory signals to the basal ganglia and thalamus. This helps with smoothing movements and with preventing unwanted movements. We have an area of gray matter which deals with pain awareness, and you can see that area of gray matter kind of right in here, this just below the cerebral aqueduct. We also have the tectum. The tectum is the roof of the midbrain, right here. Tectum. And you can also see it on this view of the midbrain up here. So these 4 dots or bulges are part of the tectum. We can also see the epithalamus, which is not part of the midbrain. It's part of the forebrain, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But these 4 bulges make up the corpora quadrigeminea. So quad 4, these are the 4 structures that make that up. And the corpora quadrigeminea is part of the tectum or roof of the midbrain. So it's above our cerebral aqueduct. This area deals with visual tracking and reflexes. So the superior colliculus, or together superior colliculi, deals with visual tracking, and the inferior colliculus, or if we look at the left and right together, colliculi, deal with turning towards noises. When there's a noise on one side of your head, you'll have an auditory reflex to turn your head towards that noise. The forebrain includes both the diencephalon and the cerebrum. The diencephalon is 3 structures that all have similar names. There's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The epithalamus includes the abonuela, which connects the limbic system to the midbrain. We'll talk about what the limbic system does in a little bit when we talk about the functions of the brain. The forebrain also includes the cerebrum, the part that you normally think of when you think of a brain, all of the ridges and grooves. This cerebrum has 4 lobes, includes the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, and the limbic system, which is a functional system within the brain. The diencephalon includes the thalamus, and this structure is kind of like 2 oval-shaped scoops of ice cream that have been smooshed together. So there's a right half and a left half, and then there's a part in the middle where they connect. So as these scoops of ice cream protrude into the ventricles, they stick out to either side. The thalamus has emotional and memory functions and is a really important relay station. So it's going to relay signals from the cerebellum in the hindbrain to the motor cortex up in the cortex of the brain. There are 23 nuclei, or groups of cells with a similar function, and they receive nearly all sensory information on its way to the cerebral cortex. So we not only have signals going from the cerebellum to the motor cortex, but we also have signals from the sensory parts of our body going up to the sensory cortex. The structure is an oval mass of gray matter with a little divot in between the two halves. And it sits pretty much right in the middle of the brain. If the thalamus was our 2 scoops of ice cream, the hypothalamus is our ice cream cone. Now this is a waffle cone. If you have a waffle cone with ice cream on top, before the ice cream starts melting, that waffle cone is hollow. This is like the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is actually the waffle part of the cone, and the inside of the waffle cone, that space, is part of the third ventricle. So it's actually the walls and the floor of the third ventricle. That is what the hypothalamus is. And the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica. Remember when we talked about the saddle and the rotund cowboy sitting in the saddle? This is our rotund cowboy. He's the guy sitting in the saddle. And he is in charge of all the other glands in the body. So the pituitary gland is often called the master gland, and the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a really important area in maintaining homeostasis within our body. It functions to control hormone secretion through the pituitary gland. It's important in autonomic nervous system control, thermoregulation, food and water intake, so whether you're hungry or thirsty, sleep and circadian rhythms, so your night-day cycle. The mammillary bodies, which sort of stick out behind the pituitary gland and are inferior to the hypothalamus, these have a function in memory. And the other function of the hypothalamus is emotional behavior. So we have lots of nuclei in the hypothalamus, just like we saw lots of nuclei in our thalamus. So the hypothalamus is an important control center of the body. The thalamus is a relay center, the hypothalamus is a control center. Our last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. It is superior and posterior to the thalamus, and it's much bigger in the sheep brain, so you can look forward to seeing it clearly there. It's very small on our models. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important because it secretes melatonin. Notice that melatonin is different than melanin. Melanin makes you tan. Melatonin, secreted by the pineal gland, makes you sleepy. So our normal circadian rhythm includes an increased release of melatonin when it gets dark out at night, and then melatonin levels will go down during the day, whereas cortisol levels go up during the day and they go down at night so you can sleep. The other function of the epithalamus is olfaction. There's a structure within the epithalamus that includes an abonular nuclei. So it's a group of cells that deal with smell. This is why it's larger in the sheep. The sheep have a more refined sense of smell than we do as humans. The cerebrum includes ridges, which are called a gyrus. So a gyrus is singular, gyri are plural, and grooves are called sulci, or if we have one groove, it's called a sulcus. We have 4 major lobes within the cerebrum. We have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. And they are all named for the bone that they are under. Just be cautious and remember that the parts of the brain are lobes, not bones, even though they're under those bones. The cerebral cortex is the outer 3 millimeters of gray matter in the brain. We will see this when we dissect our sheep brains. Its extensive folds increase the surface area of the cortex and gray matter, and that allows us to have more surface area for our cell bodies and dendrites and connections in the brain. The brain is, as I said, divided into those 4 lobes. The function of the cerebral lobes: the frontal lobe has voluntary motor functions, so it has the motor planning area, and it also deals with planning, tasks, mood, smell, and social judgment, so risk versus reward behavior, and whether the behavior should be undertaken or avoided. The parietal lobe receives and integrates sensory information, so the information comes in on the postcentral gyrus and is integrated just posterior to that. The occipital lobe is the visual center of the brain, and the temporal lobe contains areas for hearing, smell, learning, memory, and emotional behavior. The cerebral cortex, those outer 3 millimeters of the brain, contains 2 types of cells. It contains stellate cells that look like little stars, whose dendrites project in all directions, and it contains pyramidal cells. These pyramidal cells look more like a pyramid and have axons that pass out of the area. So the stellate cells stay in the gray matter, whereas the pyramidal cells have axons that will leave the area. These axons bundle together into tracts of white matter. So white matter is white because of the myelin around the axons that are in the white matter. Most of our cerebrum is white matter. We have 3 types of tracts. A tract is like an information highway where everyone is going from the same place to the same place. So it's a highway for axons. We have projection tracts, and they go from the brain to the spinal cord, and these form your internal capsule. So your peduncles are going to be part of this as they move through the midbrain. We have commissural tracts, which cross from the right to the left hemisphere. The corpus callosum is one type of commissural tract. We also have anterior and posterior commissures in the brain. Finally, we have association tracts, which connect lobes and gyri within a hemisphere. So these are the shortest type of tracts because they stay within a hemisphere. The basal nuclei are groups of cells that have a similar function. They are masses of gray matter that are deep to the cortex. So instead of being around the edges, they're in the middle of the brain. There's a few different parts of the basal nuclei. So there's different groups of gray matter, so different groups of cells. And we have the lentiform nucleus, which includes the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globulus pallidus. And those are all structures that come together, and they together make the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei is very important in motor control. It connects to both the substantia nigra and the motor cortex. So those connections help us to smooth movements and prevent unwanted movements. The next thing we're going to look at is functional systems within the brain. So how different parts of the brain in different areas, the forebrain, hindbrain, and midbrain, work together to create function.